She started off in the Conservation Volunteers Natural Talent Trainee Programme at the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, where she was looking at non-marine molluscs, and she's basically gone all out on slugs since then, I think, and doing a PhD and doing stuff for the Conchological Society and on Facebook and I Record, verifying, and basically just trying to get everybody very enthusiastic about mollusks. So I think that she's going to try and convert us all now and tell us all about slugs in UK gardens and why we should fall in love with them. Over to you, Imogen.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. There we go. So hopefully everyone can now see that okay. So in this talk today, I'm mainly going to be talking about my PhD research that I'm doing at the moment. So I'm doing some research with the RHS, so the Royal Horticultural Society, who are fully funding this PhD, but also with supervisory support from Newcastle University and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So I thought I'd start off by just talking about why is a gardening charity so interested in slugs and snails? And it might not be for the reasons you think. So the RHS is actually a membership-based charity, so anyone can join, and when they join, they have the automatic right to be able to ask us any question they like about gardening. And over time, we've kept records of these questions that come in, and we've noticed that a high proportion have been slug or snail related. So they're obviously a huge concern for gardeners, but we also know that it's not that straightforward. So most of the inquiries we get will be something like this. So we have a picture of a plant with holes in the leaves. Now we have enough knowledge to be able to tell you that a slug or snail has damaged that plant, but we cannot tell you exactly which species. But we do know that there's a lot of diversity within slugs and snails as to what they will eat. So we're really keen to kind of find out more about the species that are actually found in the garden and try and figure out which ones are actually problematic for gardeners and promote a better, more nuanced understanding as well for these species groups. This is a really exciting time to be working on slugs because there's been a huge amount of dynamic change within the fauna in the last 80 years. So the FSC actually published a new guide to slugs of Britain and Ireland in 2014, and the background research that the writers did for this actually discovered that there was 20% more species of slug established in Britain than we'd realised. So there's a huge amount of species that had arrived over the past 80 years or so. And it's particularly interesting because less than half the slug fauna is actually considered native to Britain. So many of them are introduced species. And those species that have arrived are changing range within Britain and also seems to be having an impact on some of our native or longer established species, causing them to change range as well. And despite all these species coming in, there's actually very little known about many of these species, partly because they're not a popular group to study. You kind of get flurries of research groups or individual researchers being really interested in studying slugs, and then you get very quiet periods where there's very little research published at all. So many of those species new to science when they're actually found here as well. So huge gaps of knowledge, lots of things to discover about this really interesting fauna. So this is actually all the slug species found in Britain at that time in 2014. There's actually been a couple more added since then, new arrivals, so which I'm sure will be included in when they update the guide at some point. But hopefully you get a sense of that there's huge amounts of diverse appearance and diverse families and groups as well. But it's really challenging for a beginner looking at this to know where to start with slugs because a lot of them do look very brown, very slimy and quite similar. On top of that, we're really interested in gardens, which is obviously quite a man-made influenced habitat, but trying to characterize gardens as an individual habitat is really difficult because they are managed so differently by different people, but also you could have a garden that's completely lawn or a garden that's completely hard standing or a garden that's quite wild or completely vegetable bed based. So it can be a real challenge to try and kind of characterize this as one human-made habitat. When you're dealing with something slimy and sticky that depends on moisture as well, this gets quite challenging indeed because they can rely on things like microhabitats within a garden or even microclimates within that garden as well to actually survive there. So really difficult habitat to get to grips with. We've also got the challenge that this is all private property as well, so it's not easy to send me around the UK to loads of private gardens to get the to get out there surveying slugs. So this is where citizen science has been so important for my PhD. So we're really keen to engage with gardeners and get them out there looking at slugs. And by gardeners, I don't mean anyone who's particularly green-fingered. Well, we actually define a gardener as anyone who has access to a garden and spends any amount of time in it, whether that's sitting in there drinking a coffee or if they spend a long time reading. So this is kind of where the Cellar Slug survey came in. Partly because we wanted to answer a really interesting scientific question about the potential decline of a slug species, but also it's a really charismatic slug for the group in that it has this quite distinctive green and yellow mottled pattern. It's quite pretty for a slug and these bluish tentacles, but also it's a really good story to tell to gardeners because these slug species involved in this survey are not feeding on live plant material. They actually tend to feed on decaying plants or things like fungi, lichens, algae. So no plants really in the garden that gardeners are keen to grow, unless you're a particularly keen fungi farmer, and then I apologise for having these slugs around. So generally considered quite a beneficial species. So it's a really good kind of species to engage gardeners with and to engage people who haven't looked at slugs with as well before. But the reason we picked this species in particular is the yellow cellar slug used to be quite widespread throughout Britain. It's thought to have first been recorded around the 1600s, maybe a little bit earlier. There's some debate as to whether it's native or not. Generally, it's not considered to be native, but it was a very early introduction. But it used to be really, really widespread. However, in 2014, when they were producing that guide to slugs, they could only find reliable specimens from parts of South Wales and Southeast Devon. So they were really struggling to find any. So it appeared that it had really, really declined within the known range at that point. In contrast, the green cellar slug, which is quite a similar looking relative, which can actually hybridize with the yellow species, arrived in Britain and was first kind of recognized as being present in the 1970s on mainland Britain itself. It was in Ireland much earlier than that. And it seems to have the opposite spread in that its population. So we just wanted to get a lot more data where the yellow cellar slug is now to find out a lot more about it. So we produced a very simple identification guide. It's quite helpful with these two species. Although they do look similar, it is possible to tell them apart via photographs in the majority of cases. So it's quite a nice one where you could just snap a photo of it and upload it onto the form. We also decided to include the leopard slug in the survey as well, as when we were talking to gardeners about cellar slugs, often they would say, oh, I thought they were just leopard slugs, but I have those green ones in my compost bin. So we realized that this might be a potential confusion species, but also a really good opportunity to gather even more records on leopard slugs as well. So we've been collecting the data via specialized recording form on iRecord. The reason we chose to go down this route is, first of all, it means that all the data isn't just sitting at the RHS on RHS servers, but it's also then shared with the Horticultural Society of Britain and Ireland, who have the longest running mollusk data set in the UK. And it's really quite a thorough one. And it's also uploaded then to the NBN annually. So anyone can access this data in the future as well for their own research needs. But it also allowed us to put in some quite detailed questions that we wanted to know about people's gardens. So things about the size, the way they manage it, that kind of information we thought might influence whether these slugs are found there or not. So we actually launched the survey in March 2019, and then straight after that, we went out to a lot of events all around the country, particularly RHS flower shows, just to engage with everyday people, spread the word about slugs, start a conversation, and try and hopefully get them out there recording these species. So overall, we spoke to over 130,000 people about slugs at these events. And also we had these 2 custom giant inflatable slugs made as kind of a talking point and try to encourage people to take a slug selfie with them and put them on social media. So we had a really big push at that moment. And then of course, COVID came along. But the response so far has been brilliant. So the survey is still open, it's still running. You can still get out there and submit a record today if you want to. As of the end of April, we had over 850 records submitted, 713 of which had been accepted at that point. of course, as with all biological recording projects, there are some that unfortunately had to be rejected, partly because of duplicate records coming in or various records not being able to be verified because they hadn't supplied a photo or something like that, because we are seeing large amounts of error, which I will talk about in a moment. But I thought I'd briefly mention COVID, because actually we've had a bit of a benefit from the lockdowns. So because of COVID, obviously we couldn't go out on the ground to the shows anymore, but it did mean that I was able to get involved in a lot more virtual talks and reach relatively large audiences from all across the UK in one go. So I wasn't having to go to lots of different places in the UK, but just stay at home, do talks like this, and engage with people all around the country. It also meant a lot more people were stuck at home and in their gardens during lockdown. So we saw a huge surge in records in the first national lockdown. So you'll notice here on the graph on the orange line, we have that big peak, which actually stays at quite a high peak for 3 months. So that was fantastic. Then also at the beginning of this year, Kieran kindly included the RHS Cellar Slug survey as a course assignment, which also generated a lot of records at the beginning of this year as well. So actually we've managed to benefit quite a bit from COVID in actually getting more records into the survey itself. So the records so far are showing what we expected. The green cellar slug seems to be absolutely everywhere. The vast majority of records are that species. Over just around about 80% of the records are actually green cellar slug. A very small proportion are confirmed as yellow cellar slug. So it does seem to be becoming increasingly less found. But what I also find really interesting is this little blue wedge here, which is 10% of records that are completely different slug species. So the form on iRecord is actually limited in that people can only enter the 3 target species we're looking for. So that's the green cellar slug, the yellow cellar slug, or the leopard slug. So actually all of that 10% have been entered as one of those species, but it turn out not to be, which I think is really fascinating, because one of the things we know for anyone who's tried to record slugs before is that they are, although they're a very small group of species, they are a very challenging group of species. And that's partly because slugs are very plastic. They can respond very easily to environmental triggers. So that can affect the way their genes express as well. So they can look different based on different habitats, but also within populations, they can vary quite a lot as well. So they can be really challenging to identify for beginners. So it's really useful to then get kind of a sense of where people might be getting tripped up by this. And some of these are quite understandable errors. So 35 records of Ambigolimax species, which are 2 invasive species that first arrived in the 1950s. We don't think they have too much of an issue on our garden, but they do seem to be absolutely widespread everywhere now. And they've often come in recorded as leopard slugs. This is completely understandable because even as verifiers, we can find it very challenging separating these slugs from the juveniles of the leopard slug. So it makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, we have had 22 records of various Arran species, which completely different genus of slugs come in as being Limicus flavus or the yellow cellar slug. But having looked at these records, I've posted some photos of them here. You can kind of see where people were getting tripped up because these are yellow or orange looking individuals with blue tentacles. So obviously they'd kind of got the general concept, but they hadn't really realized, that some of the key anatomy is actually quite different in this family group. So I'm sure you're burning to know where actually is the yellow cellar slug. So this is the NBN distribution based on data from 2 years ago. So you can see it's pretty widespread throughout all of Britain itself, whereas our confirmed records show it does seem to be much more patchy, much more dispersed records coming in. There's obviously a notable gap here as well in the Midlands where we've had no confirmed records come in at all. So there does seem to be a lot less of them around, and they also seem to be clinging on in quite remote places. So comparing that with our data on the green cellar slug, so again, here we have the NBN distribution from a couple of years ago, shows it being really widespread by this point because it does include more recent records. And when you look at our data, it does fit very neatly with what we already know about it from the NBN. So you can see it has stayed within that range, but also we have new record as well. So for example, this one here in the Outer Hebrides, that's the first record of this species for that particular island. So it shows that it is still traveling and it is still reaching new places. So our ambition is actually to try and reach 1,000 accepted records by October, which is when the survey is probably going to close at this point. So please do log onto the website, have a look at that identification guide. It is up there as a PDF, so you can download it or print it off if you want to. Get out in your garden and see if you can find them. The best thing to do is actually to look at night using a torch, but you can also find them at daytime in things like compost bins, under logs, anywhere like that as well. So we did kind of ask people on the website to use a set methodology, but generally we've had a lot of incidental records and people just finding them, which is absolutely fine. We don't mind that at all. So do take a look, take a photo and send it in via the iRecord form, which you can find via the RHS website. So I thought I'd just briefly mention the other part of my research as well, which is the Slugs Count project. So this is quite a big citizen science project I'm currently in the middle of running. So we actually have 60 participants taking part in this from all over the UK. You can see the green dots here on the maps. And these have all been trained up to actually go out into their garden once every 4 weeks to do a 30-minute survey by torchlight and to collect all the slugs that they find during those 30 minutes along a set route, identify them, and then send the physical specimens into me at the lab so that I can double check all the identifications, which will include things like examining the genitalia as well, which is why we actually need the specimens. So we were expecting very little interest in this because we're like, who wants to go out at night and identify slugs? Probably not many people, but we were amazed to have over 2,900 applications to take part in our 60 spaces. So in the end, it turned out very difficult to actually narrow it down. I could do a whole presentation on how we managed to figure that mess out. And actually by December 2020, we'd already received 4,173 slugs. So we're generating a huge amount of information about slugs in gardens, as well as really inspiring and engaging with people, because some of the people involved in this project have recorded slugs before and others have never even looked at slugs before in their life. And we're finding lots of interesting information as well about slugs being active in winter, which was very unexpected. So thank you very much for listening to this talk. A huge thanks to so many organizations who've helped support this research. It's been absolutely fantastic, the amount of support that's been available for this. So yeah, hopefully we have time for questions.
Yeah, that's lovely, thank you. Really interesting and generated a lot of questions and talk in the chat. So we'll pick up on a couple of those now, and then perhaps if we don't get to them all, you can have a little look through afterwards, if that's okay. So there was a couple of questions about ID resources. I think you did cover it a bit, but and there's some ideas in the chat about some training course and things. But if people have a photo of a slug, where's the best place to try and get help? Is it social media or is iSpot, that kind of thing?
So there is quite an active Facebook group. I think it's called the Mollusks of is it the non-marine mollusks of Southwestern Europe? It's recently changed name, which is why I'm a bit vague of that. But if you search slugs and snails in Facebook, it should come up as one of the groups. So they're usually pretty good on there. They do like you to have a bit of a go beforehand. So if you have had a little look around and try to ID it yourself, that's usually helpful. The best identification resource really is that FSC guidebook. It's a fantastic book. It's very user-friendly. It's not your typical dichotomous key. It very much relies on photographs and it's a bit more like a multi-access key in that it won't ask you, is it this or this? It will say, is it one of these options? So it's really good in that regard. There are some websites you can look at, but most of them kind of, you have to have a bit of an idea of what you're looking for to start with. So you might, so they have really reliably identified photos, but they won't necessarily have a key on there to help you narrow down which species you have. Otherwise, you're always welcome to tweet photos of slugs at me as well. I'm very happy to look at slugs all day, so that's fine. But yeah, there's plenty of resources out there. Again, look at the Conchological Society website as well. So that's conchoc.org. They have some basic resources on there and also signposts to other resources. One of the things I didn't mention is we've actually produced 3 videos at the RHS as well, which are talking about how to get started with identifying slugs. So that's the basics on how to take good photos for identification. And you can find those on the RHS website. So that's www.rhs.org.uk/slugs count, which is about the Slugs Count project, but it also features those videos embedded there. So you can find those resources there.
Once you've identified it, if it's not one of the 3 cellar slugs, is the general iRecord form the place to put it?
Definitely, yes. So we are very active on iRecord, the Horticultural Society. They have verifiers on there, so definitely the place to put your slug records.
Brilliant. And then there was a couple of interesting questions, sort of more on the ecology side. One was about whether the hybrids of the cellar slugs are fertile or not. Is that something that you know? So when the green and the yellow ones hybridize, what happens then?
So there's very little research actually done on this. So it was only really the work by Ben Rosen to create that guide kind of identified that there were hybrids. So the theory we have is that when they hybridize, the green cellar slug is more genetically dominant. So actually they are coming out as more closely related to the green cellar slug than the yellow cellar slug. And we do think that they are fertile. So then essentially the yellow cellar slug genes are just being completely watered down. So we think it's more being outbred than anything else particularly going on there.
And one final very quick question about dispersal. So there was questions about how slugs move between sites and how they get into the country in the first place when they're not natives.
Yes.
Which is a very big topic, I'm sure. So if you could just cover it in 10 seconds, that would be great.
It's a huge topic. So basically, slugs and snails are amazing hitchhikers. They're not like insects. They're not associated with individual host plants. They can just hitchhike on anything. We don't do a huge amount in the UK about this. They do a massive amount in the US, and they keep amazing records. So they actually can tell us from their data how slugs and snails are getting in. And it's amazing things like, obviously things like the plant trade, they are coming in on that. But also unexpected things like military equipment from returning overseas, they can hitchhike on that. Shipping containers. So there's one amazing incident where they were showing me the records of species that had come from the UK on shipments. And one of the species, I was like, that's not a British species of snail. And they were saying, no, it's a Mexican one. And what had happened is it actually hitchhiked on the shipping container from Mexico to the UK port and then to the US, but it had only been detected when it reached the US. So it's just a lovely example of how adaptable they are and how easily they can spread somewhere. And of course, because they're hermaphrodites, they don't necessarily need a partner or need to find a partner of a different gender to them to actually reproduce, so they can spread quite rapidly.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. And yeah, and if you want to go and have a look in the chat and see if there's any more, thank you very much. Round of applause. So we'll go on to our next speaker now, who is Sam Thomas.